Just a warning, this episode of No Filter deals with a conversation in part about suicide. It's not all about suicide, but there is one part of the podcast where we do go there. If you need help, please call 13 11 14. Do you remember where you were the day that you heard Michael Hutchence had died?
The body of an Australian citizen who has been a resident in England for some time was discovered in the hotel on the 5th floor.
If you're a certain age, it's an event that you'll probably be able to remember pretty clearly. It was November 22nd, 1997, and one of the most famous rock stars in the world had been found dead in his Sydney hotel room. The details came out quickly and they were devastating.
The body of the INXS lead singer was discovered in a Sydney hotel room late this morning.
Michael had been up all night, first on a drug and alcohol bender with some friends in his hotel room. And then after they left in the early hours of the morning, he'd had a series of increasingly distressed phone calls with his partner, Paula Yates, who was back in London with their baby daughter, Tiger Lily. After leaving a series of distraught voicemail messages for close friends, the lead singer of INXS and one of Australia's best-known music icons took his own life. Every generation has those where were you when moments. JFK, Princess Diana, Kurt Cobain, and if you're part of Generation X, Michael Hutchence. In the 22 years since Michael's death, there have been countless documentaries and miniseries and stories and interviews all about his life, but very few of them have gotten Michael Hutchence right, until now.
Sometimes I think that he planned it all along, that he sort of, he didn't just get me up to make the first video, Burn For You, that he actually got me up to make the biography of his life.
From Mamamia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, candid conversations with interesting people. Richard Lowenstein first met Michael Hutchence when he was just 23. He was making music videos for Hunters and Collectors and Cold Chisel, and Michael really liked what Richard was making. So he called him up and commissioned him to make some music videos for INXS. Little did Richard know that almost 40 years later, he'd be the man making a documentary about his best mate's life. The good, the bad, and those mysteries that seemed to follow Michael Hutchence until the very end. Richard's documentary, Mystify Michael Hutchence, is a captivating movie filled with rarely seen footage and really intimate home videos of Michael's life at home, on holidays, backstage, on the road, even in bed, along with interviews where some of the people who were with him during all of those times talk about what it was like and the Michael that they knew. Here's something that everyone agrees on. Michael Hutchence loved women, loved them. But never in a sleazy way, in a way that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, no matter who you were. He respected women, he sought out their company, he surrounded himself with them, his sister, his mother, his stepdaughters, his female friends, his manager, and the light of his life, his daughter Tiger Lily, who wasn't even 2 when she lost her dad, and who'd lose her mum just a year or 2 later. There are 4 women, though, who defined Michael's adult life and who all feature heavily in this documentary. Michelle Bennett, Kylie Minogue, Helena Christensen, and Paula Yates. And it's through them that we learn the most about Michael in the most intimate and often heartbreaking way. Richard joins me now to talk about those 4 women and the incredible man they all loved, his friend, Michael Hutchence.
When I heard about this film and I asked who was in it, in terms of the documentary, and it was literally, you could tick off every single significant person in Michael's life, which really speaks to the trust they had in you and the trust that he had in you by extension. And what really struck me about your film was the women, the different phases of his life and the different women who really shaped those phases in many ways, or at least were adjacent to them. And I wanted to talk about Michelle, Kylie, Helena and Paula, starting with Michelle and tragically enough, or perhaps poetically enough, also finishing with Michelle. She was the last call that he made before he was found on that terrible morning in 1997. But when you met him, he and Michelle were together.
Yes.
And it was just at the beginning of their ascension, wasn't it, in terms of the band?
Yes. Michelle ended up paying most of the bills for Michael, including the rent on a house that they both lived in, that he owned, weirdly enough, and she ended up, covering the rent, which was going to the bank loan, and so she did the poor years, along with the girlfriend before, who was a huge influence, Ananda Braxton Smith. But Michelle was the first one that I interviewed that I was really connected to as a friend.
What was Michelle to him?
When you see that early footage, Michelle was absolutely stunning and a really down-to-earth character, and some descriptions that I don't think he or Michelle would have liked are things like, his touchstone or his, I think
soulmate.
That's all, yeah, soulmate. I think that's all bullshit. I think what she was someone in a very Australian way who's, very beautiful, very absolutely wonderful to be with, and a very beautiful and honest soul, who would actually cut through his bullshit as well. Because when you're on that trail and people start stroking your ego and there's, you're going up the success ladder, it is very easy, and I've experienced it myself, to start acting like a dickhead, But Michelle would be there going, come on, Michael, and he would absolutely love that. He would love being told off by Michelle.
And they were together for about 5 years, weren't they?
Yes,
through that time, and she didn't like touring, and she never was starstruck.
No.
She knew him before all of that.
Yeah, and she'd paid for dinner all the time because she had jobs, and he never seemed, they kept. It was hard to believe, but they, at the early days, even when they're playing 1,000-seat pubs and RSLs and things all packed, they kept them on such a tight, expense account. Like there was never any money to even pay rent properly. Or
he was still living in a share house in Sydney with her in Paddington, right?
Absolutely. And so the idea was all the money they earned was going into keeping the band afloat and also paying for the albums and all that sort of stuff. So they didn't rely on record companies. But that meant that their cash in hand was extremely low. But on the plus side, they did end up owning their own recordings, which very few bands can claim to have done. So, but she was definitely someone who, he was very obsessed with and very in love with, and vice versa. But their lives were just so solidly sort of different. She wasn't going to come on tour. She had to have a career, which is fair enough, and to follow that career, she needed to be in one job in one place and keep going at it. And she did modelling as well.
How
for
did
extra
it end?
money. It ended just after Dogs in Space ended. I mean, they were together through the shoot of Dogs in Space, and Michelle came and lived in Melbourne for those weeks. And then he went on tour, and then it was kind of Michael's sort of decision as they were going up the ladder to success, and he was looking at touring and touring upon touring, and he just basically, he just really did want someone who would be with him on tour, and not have to have this yearning that you see in those Kylie faxes, that it's like, wish you were here, where are you? And then you wait till the end of a 3-month stint till you both can have 2 weeks together, and then you have a wild time, then you've got to go back on the grind, and then, it's...
So he ended the relationship with Michelle because he knew that it wasn't going to give either of them what they wanted.
Yeah, Michelle was getting very unhappy with the situation. Not that she in any way wanted him to come home and be a little homebody, but... she was lonely, he was lonely. When they get together, he was partying and being, sometimes being naughty, and she would get grumpy. But then they would get back together again, and we can make it work. And then she, as she says in the film, sort of called him out and said, I want you to go away and have a holiday and see if trying to work out what it is in life you want. But I don't think he kind of knew there was all this, fame and fortune beckoning. And this was before Kick had really taken off. They'd recorded Kick, I think. And And then, he's the one who finally said, when, you seem grumpy all the time whenever we're together. And so there's always, I do think there was part of the issue with Michael, and I think is that I don't think he got bored. I think the nature of a relationship sometimes you lose unless you're really trying hard to keep that mad rush of romance that you have in the first 6 months, a year, sometimes, like my parents, sometimes 30 years, but not all the time. And you start sort of acting like a married couple, where you put out the rubbish or whatever. I do think that's not the part of a relationship Michael liked. Michael liked that excited, I really just want to be with you and you make me happy, and, and on that side of things, he was like a serial monogamist. There was no sort of hordes of groupies or whatever lining up. He might have got a bit naughtier as he became a single. He did become a single person, in inverted commas, for a few months after Michelle, before he met someone else. But in that time, he was, he might have a misdemeanor or spend a night with someone. But you see it in his diaries, which we had. It's like, I'm so sorry, I wrote Michelle and apologised, said I'll never do it again. I don't know what I was thinking, And you could see this person who was really yearning for the connection of love.
He seemed to love,
Yeah.
like love being in love, loved women.
And it made sex even better. Even as a hedonist, it made the act of lovemaking so much better for him. He would tell me that, It wasn't just like, oh, she's pretty, we can have a good time. Though
he wanted to connect.
He did have a good time, but it's like when you're in love, the sex is can be insane, And that's what he was addicted to, is that all the synapses and the sensual pleasures going off. And then that would trigger more love, So, and then the nature of the careers, even with Kylie, you'd be ripped apart by that.
Well, Kylie, I wanted to ask you about, because it was a choice that surprised a lot of people. She was at the height of her fame, but it was her Stock Aitken Waterman, post-Locomotion, I Should Be So Lucky. She was having a bit of a rough time in Australia, where people were sort of sneering at her a bit and calling her the singing budgie. He was seen as this rock god hedonist. And the pairing of them was one of the first celebrity couples that I can imagine, where 1 + 1 = 11. How did he process that in terms of the added spotlight? Because he seemed to have quite a conflicted relationship with his fame and his celebrity, and then adding Kylie to it put it on steroids.
Some of his male friends, myself included, weren't surprised at all, because, there'd be much discussion amongst all of us, like how cute Kylie was, and she, even though, butter wouldn't melt in her mouth, she was always incredibly beautiful, sexy woman, And Michael just wasn't, it wasn't that snobbery, like Mick Jagger style snobbery. It has to be a 6 foot tall model, otherwise, I don't feel ratified. It was just like, so I wasn't surprised at all.
What did they connect over?
I think they connected over, I mean, in a way, pop music does this to you. It yanks you out of school at a very young age, and you stay young, hence the song Stay Young. You actually don't mature. You stay like a child. And Michael knew this, and he actually self-educated, read heaps and everything. But still, your life experience, you're not having those issues that you have, like how to pay the mortgage.
You're kind of in a celebrity bubble.
Yeah, you're in, and people are running around looking after you, and there's always, if you... Michael wasn't a dick about it, but if he always needed someone to say, I just need a bottle of water or a packet of cigarettes, or where's the meal, it's just there it was. And I think he recognised a kindred spirit. And even though there was an age difference, I think there was a very similar desire to be children together and fall in love like that. So he meets Kylie and falls, but there's almost like there's a very strong parallel to the first few years of Michelle, where, and you can see in the faxes when you go to the letters with Michelle, which we have some in the film, I love her too much. And then 10 years later, or no, it's 6 years later, you're seeing the facts. I love you too much, you know. And it's like he's just going back to that same naive innocence. And I think there is something, if you analyse Michael's lyrics, you know, there's Don't Change, there's Stay Young, there's these theme songs which is saying he had problems with mortality, and the problems are not just him and his desire to be young and lithe and sexy. They're actually put on you by the pop industry, because the pop industry idolises youth and beauty and talent. I'm not saying, you know, people like Kylie or Ariana Grande aren't talented. They're extremely talented, but they also, as they charge up the ladder, including Michael, are young, beautiful and talented. But then time moves on, and 10 years later, when most people were just reaching their prime in whatever job or career they've decided to follow, and most artists definitely, filmmakers, painters are all still reaching their prime, the pop industry tells you you're a has-been, and some other young upstart comes along and reminds you you're a has-been, like the Oasis dudes.
That's just one of the most heartbreaking clips in the film. Can you explain what happened?
The freshly upcoming Oasis, Noel and Liam Gallagher, and it was Noel this time. It's not normally it's Liam being a dick, but in this case it was Noel Gallagher being a dick. Came up and he's 22, Michael's 32, or no, 35 I think, and basically
Michael presented an
Michael
award.
presents him with the best upcoming band award or something like that. And he sort of graciously says, you know,
Has-beens shouldn't present awards to gonna-be.
And
and then he walks off the stage.
Then he walks off stage, and
Michael
Michael's
just looks
sort of
crestfallen.
Yeah, he's crestfallen. He doesn't know, you know, because he's obviously it's a very vulnerable sore point to him. He's 35. He still should be, and probably is in the peak of his abilities, but he's being reminded that pop is got a disposable element. And if you can't sell those 6 million records, you're about to be shunted out to pasture and, you know, maybe be an old fella band or whatever. But one of the dilemmas with those big bands, and I don't think Oasis did it well at all, you know, karma gets you and 10 years later they're being shunted out. But one of the dilemmas you have when you're at that point in your career is, am I going to manage to somehow follow the path of U2 and the Rolling Stones and keep going, playing stadiums, and not just keep going playing, but keep going being popular and having songs that go up the charts? Or am I going to go the way of 95% of pop and disappear and, you know, still make albums more than likely, but they only sell a few 100,000 or something.
And then you're not playing stadiums anymore.
Yeah, and you're not playing stadium. You can't fill a stadium. So they were as that was happening, the Oasis incident, he was going through this dilemma and fighting a whole lot of demons. One of the biggest ones was, how do I keep me and my band on top of our game and playing, you know, big venues? And a whole lot of managerial and other decisions had gone against them. But, you know, the records hadn't sold so well. They changed record companies, not on their, management kind of forced them to change a record company that didn't go so well. There was all sorts of details of what was going on. There's like that, and they were struggling without knowing the full level of what was going on to stay on top. And they were writing songs, and I don't believe the songs were getting worse. You know, I think the songs
The industry was changing.
Yeah. The style of music was changing. The production of the songs of their songs was changing, and perhaps that's where some more interesting risks could have been taken. But so he had a lot on his plate to try and we want to be like the Rolling Stones. We want to have a career out of this, not just be one hit. You know, they weren't one hit wonders, but you know they weren't. They were trying to reverse the slide down.
You talk about him being quite insecure about U2, even though he's friends with Bono, and Bono's in your film talking about how Michael never knew what an incredible voice that he had and how talented he was.
Yes.
He always felt inadequate, didn't he?
Yes, and he had enough.
A deep insecurity.
And he had enough people reminding of, you know, in the, let's say, the early 90s, And there was not only a very strange decision that's mentioned in the film to go from playing stadiums to playing pubs. And the media and the pop music industry don't have time to think of that as an intellectual decision to get back to the roots. They just sort of going, oh, INXS aren't playing, 80,000 seat stadiums anymore, even 20,000 seat arenas. They're playing these 500 or 1,000 standing room pubs. Why is that happening? Oh, they must not be going so well. So it was a very strange,
bad strategy.
and stupid strategy that was handed to them by someone who shall remain nameless. So Michael had to be the face that would go to the radio interviews and try and rationalise that decision as if it was his idea.
You're playing in front of 100,000 people, and you're in tremendous control.
Okay.
All right, let's say it's a festival to help people who are hungry.
A big bar.
You can find all these interviews that he's just like so unconvincing what he's saying, and it's literally been told to say it. So there was a lot of stuff going wrong at that stage that he felt he was being left to deal with. And
as the lead singer, there's always you become the face of the band, and he's the one that people wanted to put on the covers of magazines. He's the one that they wanted to interview. How does that manifest within a band? Because I imagine there's partly jealousy from the others and partly resentment for him that he has to work much harder than his 5 bandmates.
Yes. Well, they did set up very early the band as a sort of a collective where major decisions were passed by votes, like everyone, like a little democracy. But also the creative process and everything was everyone had egos, not just jealous, but they wanted to be part of the decision-making process. But ultimately it was left down to Michael to talk through those, because he's the mouthpiece, whether it's in an interview. So when something was done, whether it's we're not playing this concert, we're playing that concert, or we're not joining U2 and Midnight Oil with an anti-nuclear war concert, we're doing, it was left down to Michael to sometimes explain or justify away things that he didn't really believe in himself, because that was the majority decision of the band. So there is a collective feel that I think even bands with less band members like U2 have a much easier way of it, because it's really
a lot of opinions and voices.
Yeah. And as soon as you even go down to 4 band members, you've got much less opinions and voices, you say. And a lot of the band members in INXS are very opinionated and very, that won't just accept. There'll be lots of arguing through the night about this or that and everything. And I'm not saying Michael wanted to be a dictator or anything, but there was that thing, like the sequence you see in the film where Andrew Farriss is sort of like fairly dryly saying, we're a collective, and then Michael puts his head in and says, I'm the mutineer, because that really was
he has to carry the can.
Yeah, that was how it was working out. And sometimes that mutineering didn't go so well. Sometimes he felt, I'm bearing, like the Oasis thing. It's not that he's not coming up and saying INXS are has-beens. He's coming up and saying, Michael, you're in the spotlight. You're the has-been. And so it's a combination of sometimes you have to cop it as a person, and sometimes, even though the decisions have been made by the collective.
He broke up with Kylie. And it was reminiscent of his breakup with Michelle. It was something that obviously caused him, by the way she describes it, a huge amount of anguish and distress, and left her brokenhearted as well.
Yes.
And his next significant relationship was with Helena Christensen, the supermodel. And that was a whole other level of global fame, because then it was the height of the supermodel era, and Christy Turlington and Cindy Crawford, and he was running with that pack, spending a lot of time in Paris. And it was while he was with her that a really defining moment in his life came that night, that they decided to grab pizza and then cycle back to her apartment. Can you explain what happened?
From what I understand it, from Helena's eyewitness viewpoint, is that they'd left their home to get pizza. They hadn't been out partying. They hadn't been drinking. They'd gone to get pizza in the middle of the night. They were on their Copenhagen push bikes, eating the slice of pizza, and Michael was just there motionless, not riding the bike in any way. He was just standing there motionless, and unbeknownst to him, there was a taxi trying to get through this narrow laneway from behind, and the taxi didn't beep its horn or anything. He was just eating his pizza, and the taxi driver got out and walloped him from behind like a coward punch, a king hit. Yeah.
We were riding home on our bikes. This insane taxi driver got out of his car and punched him.
And Michael fell still on the bicycle and cracked his head on the curb of the sidewalk. And she turned at the impact and saw him on the ground and saw blood coming out of his nose and ear, which is a sign of something serious, and rushed to him and thought he was dead. And the taxi driver gets back in his cab and drives off. Then, ambulance comes, paramedics take him in the back. She's still unconscious, so she's there, crying and thinking he was dead. The two paramedics in the ambulance start talking in Danish, saying that, that's that rock star and he must be off his face on drugs, and, these rock stars like that. And she speaks Danish and she understands and lets them have it. And then arrives at the hospital, and they sort of rush him in to emergency. He comes conscious again and immediately starts getting up and ripping all the things off and saying, get me out of here. And they allow him to check himself out, thinking similarly like the ambulance drivers, that he's just a drunk rock star. But he's not. He's concussed. He's got the blood, as we mentioned, and but no one had the courage or strength or even the seniority, apparently, to hold him in emergency and saying, no, you need tests, you need MRIs and everything. So they just let him out. So, my interpretation of that is he was kind of a victim of the stereotype. He had the long hair, he looked like, he's easily recognisable. And I think it's been happening ever since, people just, even when they know about that incident, interpret it as, I've heard versions where he's coming out of a club totally off his face, and then he gets into a fist fight with the taxi driver, and he had it coming. He was being a dick. He was banging on the top of the cab. No one knows. The only person that knows is Helena, and it's the first time she's ever said anything. And he would change this. Michael never let the truth get in the way of a good story, so he would change the story. Sometimes it was a motorcycle in Thailand. Other people think it was his Harley Davidson, but it was a very un-rock and roll scenario of an old Copenhagen push bike with a slice of pizza. And then the legend takes hold, and and the story gets bigger. But what happened then was that he was holed up in Helena's apartment for a month, and absolutely, Helena, again, there's an age difference. Helena was 22. Michael's 32. She's not in a confident enough place with him, because it was still early days for them, to actually say, you have to go to hospital, because he'd saying, don't be ridiculous, I'm fine. But he was so obviously not fine. He was throwing up, he was not sleeping, he very unlike Michael, he wasn't eating, not interested in food. And she kept having to go off on jobs and everything and leave him there by himself. But a month of that, he finally does allow her to let a doctor in to the apartment, and the doctor just sort of kind of freaks out and says, you need a brain scan, and then they fly to Paris and they get a brain scan, or MRI, and then they both see what really is going on, and then he swears her to secrecy.
And it was a pretty terrible brain injury that he had.
Yeah, that's what you need to see the film to see what really, because it's not really till the end of the film that you reveal what had gone on in that. But ultimately, it wasn't just loss of taste and smell. He'd lost, his nerves to his olfactory system. The smell network had been severed, but there was something worse as well, and that's what he swore everyone to seek. Oh well, it's only Helena, and she wasn't even allowed to tell her parents any of that.
As his friend and someone who was close to him, looking back, could you see a difference in him before and after that accident?
Absolutely. It was much discussed with our film crews, who'd filmed with Michael over the previous decade. And then he arrives not many weeks after that. First of all, they go to the Isle of Capri to record Full Moon Dirty Hearts. And then they arrived in Melbourne with all the rough mixes, with the idea of doing an entire video album. So they ended up being in Melbourne for quite a while, filming those videos. And it was very obvious, and even my partners in Ghost, who all, ended up going to the bar afterwards or whatever with him, it was very obvious that trying to have a coherent conversation with Michael was very different. And this hadn't been a slow transition to, as he took more drugs or got older or anything or got more famous. This was just sudden. He was like, 3 months ago he wasn't like that. So, because we saw him every 3 months pretty much.
And you knew nothing of the fact that he'd been injured.
I knew that he told me and a whole lot of other people about this King hit, and he lost his sense of taste and smell.
Did you link the two? His behaviour?
I certainly did, yeah. I sort of was going, it's not King hit, but you can't. You're not in a position of saying, "You sure you haven't got more damage?" I did think for one stage that he had a fractured skull, and maybe I know nothing about neurology. I thought, the fractured skull, maybe that's where when he drinks alcohol, it gets in and he goes weird. But it was very obvious that after one beer, he was fine normally, but at one beer and he went very strange. And I remember seeing, it's like we hadn't done
aggressive strange?
Anything.
What kind of strange?
No, totally unable to finish a conversation, totally, like Martha mentions in the film, obsessive conversations, repeated conversations, changes of subject very radically in the middle of a sentence, and you're sort of having trouble going, hold on, weren't we talking about piracy just then, and now we're talking about Margaret Thatcher or something? It's like, what's going on? And so it was very
disconcerting.
Disconcerting, and also, my immediate thing is like, I think you do need help. I don't know, I didn't know the significance of what was going on, but I do think you need, I was always a great believer with a lot of people on therapy analysis.
Was he open to that?
Yeah, of course. He's always open to new things, but the fact is he travels all the time. So, the trouble with analysis and therapy, or even continuous medical attention, is you need to be in one spot. You can't just sort of go. And what he had a tendency to do was go and get prescribed for something. In this case, it was to battle the depression that came from loss of smell and this damage. And he would get Prozac, was the big drug of the time, and then he would fly to another place, and for another part of the tour or another album or something. And then, then he'd just say, I need more of that Prozac pill. He wouldn't sort of go and get, and it's very hard when you're travelling. You don't
have any continuity of care.
You don't have your own physician and everything.
Richard, how long after he was King hit did his relationship with Paula Yates begin?
Some say there was
an overlap?
A secret relationship going back to that very first
interview they did.
In the mid-'80s, where it's on the Tube and they're both flirting outrageously.
You were saying earlier on that in Australia the music is more important than image, and in England everyone's very concerned about your trousers. I'm not surprised, actually, looking at those. But do you find that's happening to you a lot?
Yeah, well, people sort of looking and say, well, you have to dress a certain way to play a certain music. You know, it happens all over the place. I don't know. We're not really concerned. We're just concerned with our music.
And how would you describe
Comfortably we dress.
Comfortably, yes. Yeah. They look a little tight to me. Now, how would you describe the music?
Rock music.
Now, in all the polls that I was reading in Countdown magazine, you know, when it came to Sexiest Man, you won.
Is there a category for that?
Yeah. Sexiest Man.
I don't read them.
Now, what about Paul Mel Gibson? What's he now?
Oh, Mel, yeah, he's, you know...
Just forget it now.
Forget it, yeah.
Oh,
and there is a theory that there was a secret affair going on, but I don't know the ups and downs.
Was he ever able to be monogamous with any of his partners, or was that just something that you would never expect if you were dating Michael Hutchence?
Seriously monogamous? I mean, he
not having sex with other people.
Oh, that one.
Or is that just ridiculous to say when you're talking about a rock star?
I think Michael really liked the idea of being monogamous, but the actual physicality of it. And I think it really came down to the distance. I mean, you go through all of these girlfriends after Ananda, and everyone had to suffer the distance. It's like, you know, if you actually look at the 2 years he was within Kylie, and then you work out how long were they actually physically in the same room together, you know, for a holiday or a weekend, or I've flown to Tokyo, and it comes down to 3 months. And then the same with Helena. It's like they had a great Christmas at this time, and they had a great blah, blah, but he's touring. And so I do think what was happening, I think if there was a period there where Michael had a girlfriend called Johnny who was between Michelle and Kylie. And I do think...
She had quite short dark hair, didn't she?
Yeah. And because she was on tour with him, it's very hard not to be monogamous. She was on tour with him, and he did enjoy that monogamous period where he was literally with this girl that he loved and da-da-da-da. And then that came to its conclusion for their own reasons. But I do think, you know, Michael's idea of monogamy was that, well, if I'm here alone and I look like being alone for the next 2 or 3 months, then maybe this one night will be all right. And he did have these little times where he kind of pretended the girl he'd just met, maybe for the weekend or whatever, was the partner. He wasn't just like, oh, that was good sex, see you later, love. It was, which a lot of rock and rollers are like, you know. It was almost like these mini relationships, because he was lonely, because they had this fundamental love of connection, love of family, love of everything, and he just ended up in an empty hotel room. And, you know, there's no coincidence that he killed himself in an empty hotel room, even though the love of his life, you know, was in a car heading towards him, you know. And
when you say the love of his life, you weren't referring to Paula Yates. You're referring to Michelle Bennett.
Yes, and I'm not. And when I say that, I don't mean they were going to get together and be happy families. I'm not quite sure that was ever going to happen, because I think Michael was like a gypsy. I think I felt much like he was addicted to going on stage. He was addicted to that rush of falling in love.
He seemed to fall very hard and fast for Paula, and something we haven't spoken about but that you cover beautifully in the film is the complex relationship he has with family, and his own family breaking up when he's a kid, and his sister and his mum and his brother. He was always very attracted to that idea of family, and with Michelle he had it in the share house and the little family that they made. Obviously there was a sense of family with the band.
Yes.
You sort of suggest that this sense of family with Paula is almost more important to him than Paula herself.
I don't think it was more important. I think it was part of an entire package that was incredibly seductive and addictive. And Paula herself, as you can see in that Big Breakfast interview that we're talking about, was an incredibly seductive, flirtatious, charming, charismatic woman.
Boy, this is a guest who has tackled troubling trousers. This is a guest that has everything that a rock star needs to have. Danger, talent, curly hair, and Australian subtlety. And for the first time, this is a guest that I want to have my leg over.
And I could totally understand him falling for her, family or no family. But she came with these things that a lot of men might say, oh, you know, that's baggage. But Michael was going, no, that's comfort, that's security, that's...
he loved that she was a mother of 3 little girls.
Yeah, and she could solve all these problems, including the problem of him, you know, that she would protect us all because she was big and strong and...
older than him.
Yeah, and knew, and had ins to this wonderful British world of writers and artists and, you know, great lawyers like Geoffrey Robinson was her close friend, Kathy Lett was her close friend. And, you know, he didn't have a hope of getting into that world. You know, he'd just been through the world of Helena and all these designers. Which,
Naomi Campbell and Cindy Crawford.
I got to say, you know, even with the designers you're meeting, it's a seriously superficial world. You know,
Versace and...
Yeah, it's based on physical beauty and the talent of designers who are themselves celebrities, and you're hanging out after parties. And then he lands on Paula. And suddenly she's there with, you know, Nick Cave, who he's idolised since he was young, and she's best friends with Bono, and she's best friends with Geoffrey Robinson, and not, you know, and it sort of blew him away, and it actually goes back to Ananda at the beginning, who was a poet who said, you know, let's go and live in Amsterdam and live in, you know, and be struggling artists in a garret and hang out with these artists and poets and musicians. And he went, yeah, that's something, you know, as a 17-year-old, he's going, yeah, that's something great to do. And
the only problem was who Paula was married to at the time that their relationship started, which was Bob Geldof. And it's hard for people to understand. It wasn't just sort of 2 celebrities who were together. He was considered, and still is, a sort of this icon, beatific, godlike character because he masterminded Live Aid, a big benefit for African children during the famine and the drought in the 80s.
And the result of Live Aid, which is bigger than Live Aid itself, which basically he was sanctified, and quite rightly, I believe, along with Midge Ure, who co-did it with him. It doesn't get much attention, but he was sanctified because he saved thousands and thousands of African people and kids from starvation. So it's a very tough thing.
You don't want to come and have an affair with that man's wife.
No. And it's a very tough thing to be dragged into a battle like that. So he falls for Paula, he falls for her family, he falls for her daughters. They... you know, that in itself is a huge, tumultuous tabloid media event because, as you say, the sanctification of Bob. And I don't say, you know, Saint Bob in any sense of cynicism because he is a great man. You know, he is who he is. He's a grumpy Irishman, but he seems to be a great man. And it's a man, I believe, Michael, in other situations, would just love to have been best friends with, absolutely died to be best friends with Bob Geldof.
But they were sort of put against each other by their mutual love of Paula and then by the press.
Absolutely.
And it then turned into a custody battle.
Yeah. And it's but a really weird one because he's locking antlers with someone he deeply respects and then has been told all these things by that I don't know how true they were about, you know, Bob being a crook and Bob stealing money and all this stuff. And it's all these noises going on in his head. And you've got this limited ability with the cognitive thing post the assault, and he can't work out the truth from the bullshit. And I experienced that with him really clearly numerous times.
What do you mean?
Well, I was in the hotel room when the big scandal about opium was happening. The opium scandal was that this very weird Dickensian housekeeper supposedly discovered a box of Smarties with 2 or 3 little balls of opium in it under the bed, which was kind of strange because the bed was a futon on the floor and I've seen pictures, so how she found it under the bed, I don't know. But anyway, she goes to Bob. Bob goes to the police. The police go to the tabloids, or the tabloids have the phones tapped as they were doing back then. And suddenly it was all over the headlines, and you sort of see this in the movie, you know, opium found in Smarties packet. And it was just so obviously, for one, the tabloids are relating to Smarties, meaning the opium's in the Smarties packet, and Smarties relate to children. It was just way too planned, so that the opium is within reach of the children, and so then the children need to be taken away from these naughty Michael and Paulas. And it was just, so, I mean, it was, as one of the people in the film say, it was bollocks, and it was, and I'm not saying Bob planned it, I doubt, you know, I don't think at all, but I'd say the housekeeper, who was, you know, a very strange woman, decided that she could make some money by selling this story to the press, and that these two sort of hapless people who seemed to be in Australia at the time wouldn't interfere with that, and that's what happened. And so Paula gets called back to London because there's a custody, you know, suddenly Bob says, I'm taking my kids because that ain't right. She gets called back to London. Michael has to stay in Australia with Tiger because
they've had a baby together since then,
baby,
Tiger
yeah.
Lily.
And so Tiger, they don't want Tiger being caught up in the custody battle, so he stays in Melbourne in this case. She flies back to London. I'm in a hotel room with him for those 3 or 4 days, so I'm hearing all the phone calls and the this and the that. You're not allowed to go out to a nightclub because then if the photographers see you, they'll say you're a bad parent. I'm going, what? We're not even allowed to go to the bar? And, you know, not even the hotel bar. These were the things he was being told. And not by lawyers or people that know. It's just by, close friends, let's say. And so you get a first-hand experience that he could not work out if what he was being told was the truth or not. But so he'd sit there and I'd try and say, Michael, it's all right. They're not going to steal Tiger. They're not going. And he would have these long, convoluted arguments with you about how there's a law in the 4th century or the 14th century that's in the Magna Carta saying that if a father is no good, you know, they can take his child, the other father, the previous. I'm going, I don't think they're going to enact a law from the 14th century to you, Michael. It's like, yes,
who was
yes,
actually looking after Tiger?
He was in the hotel room, yeah.
Was he a good dad?
He was a wonderful dad, yeah. And there was a nanny there as well, and, you know, someone to do the feeding and everything. There was a whole lot of security people there, and it was all kind of very dark and creepy, I got to say, because some of the people that were congregated around this guy who was, you know, was in his dyed black hair stage were pretty creepy, to say the least. And I didn't like the vibe, but I stayed with him for a number of days there, and you know, and observed that he kind of had no idea what was up or what was down or what to believe, you know.
Richard, how did Michael's friends view Paula during this time?
Paula was incredibly charming and lovely, and I think when they both, as it says in the film, they both sort of dove down into drug use. It was really at the last, 6 to 9 months. But at this stage, I remember going out to dinner with them a few times, and it was just like, I still remember it very clearly because it was like not just them, but the people they would, in this case it was Jeffrey Robinson and Kathy Lett. It was just one of the most sort of sparklingly entertaining and intellectual and discussive nights I've had. I'm going, wow, that's like, it wasn't just Michael and me talking sort of crap. It was really stimulating. And you could just see Michael's eyes lighting up on the people around the table that were really like bright sparks. I mean, I think at one stage Paula was having people like Salman Rushdie round to dinner and things like this. And so Michael was like the little kid from the North Shore or whatever, and then, couldn't believe what's in front of him, what's around the table. At the same time, there's really obvious psychological and sort of Freudian parallels to what was happening when he was a kid in Hong Kong, where he'd be there around the table and Klaus Kinski would walk in to his mum and dad's cocktail parties, and he's, you know, and he's going, oh, that's the guy in all those funny movies. And it's like, you know, so he'd grown up in this world, and then he finds a mother figure who's also a lover, who's also got an instant family, and then the mother of his own child. And that's a very intoxicating mix psychologically, you know.
It still wasn't enough for him, though, was it?
No, well, it's because it got really complicated. By the time the girl that appeared at the end, Erin, appears, he'd met Paula, all that, you know, amazing time, the first year of thing where I'm so in love, and he'd tell everyone I'm so in love and everything. By the time he meets Erin in the last year of his life, everything had turned very, very complicated. And I don't believe he was, it was a reflection of his actual heartfelt feelings to Paula or his daughter. I believe he wanted out. He wanted he was entangled in this huge thing and it wasn't about locking antlers with Bog. He was entangled in this huge sort of web of deceit, of manipulation, of
Paula
lies.
was threatening to take her life.
There's all these sorts of things going on, and there was and not just Paula, but some very unsavoury characters that had gravitated towards him, including his own accountant, who was obviously laying up the structure to steal all this money, which he did. And then he meets this beautiful, sweet, innocent girl in a hotel lobby who reminds him, even physically, of Michelle, you know. And not Michelle, like, oh, I can be with Michelle, but what Michelle represented, the earlier simple times when life was simple, when life was full of pleasure, and you could see that he would, when you talked to Erin, he would grab these sort of little moments in a bubble where he could pretend nothing else was there, and then the phone would ring, and then everything would come crashing down, and he'd realise, you know, there's a very complicated world out there that he's having trouble working it out, you know.
We'd never heard from Erin before.
No.
Was she with him on that last night?
No, not the last night, no. Because that was in Sydney and she was firmly based in LA. So she, by that stage, he had broken up with her, consciously about 4 or 5 weeks before he left for Sydney. But they had this 3 to 4 month relationship. He was in LA at that period doing his solo album while Paula was had to stay in London because of the family and the girls and everything. So he was in LA. Paula would come and visit sometimes. And this is not just based on this girl's testimony. Not only did I have her diaries, which as a 20-year-old, she'd wrote the date and everything that happened, like a lot of 20-year-olds do. But also there were some very close friends of Michael that I knew very well who were living in LA, who observed them together for those. And you know, the one, Nick Conroy, basically, we didn't put his voice in the film at that stage, but he basically ratified to me that this was a very special 4 months for Michael, and he literally said, she reminded me of Michelle, you know, and yeah.
Richard, with what you knew before and what you've learnt since, what do you think happened on that last night?
What I think happened is fairly sort of clear, is that, and it's the morning, is that because there was this string of phone calls, and I've spoken to everyone who was at the other, except Bob, of course, who was at the other end of the phone call, and so I could pull together a very clear indication of what his mindset was like. 1 minute it was down and defeatist, next minute was angry. And then the final phone call was I think it's like 9:36, or don't quote me, it's 9:56 to Michelle, where he was basically sobbing his eyes out and saying, you know, I can't take it anymore. I can't take it. I need to see you. I can't stand being alone. I need to, you know, can you come? Even though they did have a breakfast date that was prearranged, but even though I don't want to have breakfast, please come anyway. You know, I've got to go to rehearsal, but I don't want to go without seeing you. So she hops in her car and, you know, rushes to see him. And the trip is 20 minutes or 24 minutes to be exact. And then she goes and knocks on the door and there's no answer. And he's, so, you know, knowing what we know, what the hotel maid found, you know, an hour and a half later, he was obviously either unconscious or dead at that point. And you do not do what has been, you know, hypothesised straight after you're, you know, been bawling your eyes out down the phone.
So some people said it was a sex act, solo sex act gone wrong around auto asphyxiation.
Well, I do believe, and after showing the full coroner's report and all the phone records and the toxicology to experts in the field of suicide, and they basically looked at the toxicology report and looked at the autopsy, which is, you know, as coherent as an MRI, and basically said, you know, this person has the three major indicators of being a very high suicide risk, and each one puts him into the high risk category. But when you've got three of them going together, it's like a perfect storm of suicide risk, is literally what they said. And this psychologist who dealt with thousands of suicide attemptee victims said, I can't believe no one's picked up on this before. I said, because no one's really seen the autopsy before, the full unedited autopsy report and coroner's report. And the three big high risk factors are, one, his level of alcohol in his blood was extremely high, which apparently is very common amongst suicide attempts. The other was that he had insomnia. He hadn't been asleep in 48 hours at least, and perhaps even longer, because they could trace the phone calls going back, and then the previous day rehearsals. They knew he was at dinner, and you know, there was evidence going back that he hadn't slept. And the third one was traumatic brain injury, which puts you in a high risk category as well. So this doctor's saying this is 101% a suicide, but it's not a suicide where you sit there and plan a note and you've been planning it for days. It's this sporadic, spontaneous fit of this is my way out. And you convince yourself, he said, you convince yourself that your loved ones are going to be much better off without you. And it's not a rational convincing. It's you go, look at what I've brought onto these people. I've brought this hell onto my daughter. I brought this hell onto my partner, because, you know, in the 1.5 years, Paula had gone from this vibrant person to this bit of a mess, as he had. And you don't actually, I mean, I'm not of the camp that, you know, get down on Paula. I think she was caught up herself in something much bigger and much more psychological, and you have to give her a huge amount of sympathy. I mean, she meets Michael, he reminds her of when she first met Bob Geldof. He's this rock star playing to stadiums in her mind anyway, even though he wasn't at that stage. And it's a fresh love. It's kind of like what I was saying when Michael meets Kylie and then Michael meets Helena. It's like, wow, this is like, and from all the eyewitness evidence of that first year, you know, it was speaking to people like Kathy Lett and Belinda Bruin, who saw them at, Michael and Paula at the very beginning, they were like these young teenage lovers, couldn't keep their hands off each other. It was always, they were both going back and enjoying their youths again. If only that flush of love, or those endorphins, or what's they, oxytocin, and
oxytocin.
Yeah, and it's all the eyewitness reports are like they're just like teenagers and they're just having a ball until it all started to unravel. So I do I'm not absolutely not pointing any fingers at Paula. I think she discovered not long earlier that her real father was not who she thought her father was. So there was a lot of repressed psychological worries about that. There was this desire for security of the future, and then think about it. How do you think you're going to go being married or a partner to Michael Hutchence, knowing his track record? How are you, as Paula, with your 4 daughters, going to stop him being who he is and finding an Erin, or finding and moving on? I don't think Michael. Anyone who knew Michael knew he was never going to end up in a house playing Happy Families. Maybe when he was 70 or 80, but
The first credit in your film is actually thank you to Tiger Hutchence Geldof.
Yes.
Do you see her? Do you have a relationship with her still?
We have a millennial style text relationship, and she did fly to Melbourne from Perth. She was in Perth seeing her boyfriend and seeing her boyfriend's family, and we convinced her to fly to Melbourne and have, this is after I'd seen her in London and she'd given her support in the film. So, yeah, she is a great kid. I think we're continually texting each other and seeing how she's going. I send her pictures of the poster on the wall, and she's the person older person that she's really closer to is her grandma Susie Hutchence, and that's kind of how I met her, via Susie's sort of blessing, really. But yeah, she was. I was very impressed. I mean, she's just graduated from a psychology degree, and when I met her in London, she was working in prisons. Doing work experience in prisons, talking to to murderers and things, but she was complaining more about the social workers that she had to work with, how sexist they were. I said, prisoners are fantastic. It's just the social workers are so sexist. And
having lost both her parents and then been ironically raised by Bob and her sisters, one of whom she tragically lost a few years ago as well. You said she's still in contact with Susie. Is she okay? There's kind of like
mentally, she's very good.
Cultural concern and sense that, she's the daughter of this absolute icon that we've lost. And that's a big burden to bear, I imagine.
I think all the tragedy in her life goes into one big burden, and I think she has her very personal way of dealing with it, and that's partly not wallowing in it. So, when she did look at the rough cut of the film, and she got very emotionally involved in it, largely because there was a whole side to Michael she'd never heard of, or you can't find on the internet and things like this. And I think she was incredibly thankful that in one easy-to-digest package there was a whole lot of stuff about her dad that she felt now she could connect with, including his music and everything, because I was lucky enough in the research of the film to come across one of his acoustic guitars with all the stickers and very classic Michael stickers all over it and battered road case and things, and he could barely play guitar, but he still had an acoustic guitar. And so I ended up giving it to her, and she was just that musical connection she was incredibly thrilled with. And psychologically I could not fault her. I mean, she's an inspiring kid. Bob's brought her up beautifully. Like, he doesn't throw money at her, to say the least. It's like she's living like a student in a shared house. It was very similar to a scene like from Dogs in Space. It was quite amusing, actually. It's like all her clothes on the floor and everything. But But she did say after viewing the film, I'd prefer not to do that again, because it does bring up not just emotions about her dad, but about the whole story brings up. That story brought a lot of changes into her life, and it brought her into being, but also a whole lot of repercussions. The one thing she is, I believe, quite disturbed about, I believe she just tells me, is that there doesn't seem to be any legal acknowledgement or even financial acknowledgement that she is her father's daughter, because, for one, the entire estate has been stolen. And she, and I was saying, well, maybe it's still going to come to you when you're 25 or whatever. And when she stopped laughing and going, no, we've given up on that. It's literally gone.
Because the perception is that she would have inherited everything from him.
That's the perception, but there's the whole thing was kept in this very convoluted group of shelter companies and tax dodgers and
embezzled away
in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas, and basically it all got exposed in the Paradise Papers about a year and a half ago, and there was a huge Four Corners expose on it. And ultimately the end result of that is that there's nothing left for her. And I think she said she met up with the dodgy accountant, let's call him, and he handed her an envelope with £500 in it and said, there you go, girlie, that'll tide you over. And it's like, I think Bob shook his head in horror and walked out. They both walked out saying, we're never going to get anything, it's all offshore. And then on top of that, she doesn't seem to be a recipient of any of the in-excess percentages either.
Where does his share of that go?
That's a very big question that I think a lot of us would like to get to the bottom of, including Tiger. There's been no communication we know that the dodgy accountant has not been receiving the royalties for quite a while because they've been stopped at the Australian end. So where do they all go? It's a big question mark. I don't know. But I know that when we paid her a license fee for her dad's solo recordings of Max Q, I think there's 4 songs we used in the film, and it was quite a nice chunk of money for a kid her age. And she was so grateful and thankful and said, this is the first money I've ever received from my dad's artistic endeavours.
Wow.
And that was only about 3 months ago. And
That's extraordinary.
Yeah. So there's...
Do you think she'll ever come out and speak publicly?
I think it's highly, highly likely. In fact, she was discussing it when we first met, and she had her girlfriends there going, "You have to make a stand. This is ridiculous." It's really quite a. And I'm sort of going,
it is.
Can we just license the music from the film first? Can you send that email you were talking about first before you set the whole world on fire with this? Because I don't know. I honestly don't know where it's gone. The band members don't seem to deal with it, or they're being told something, and they.
Because I imagine there's going to be a big chunk of royalties when your film comes out. I know that since I've seen it, I can't stop playing the music. So
I would hope so. There was a big chunk, even with the miniseries. They had 5 albums in the top 10. Where is her share of those? Even if the publishing is all gone, because I do know Chardonnay and the Colin Diamond sold all Michael's publishing to Warner Chappell and then grabbed the money for something like $6 million and grabbed the money and disappeared with it. Even if that's all gone, Michael owned, the band, and Michael owned 1/6 of all the master recordings. So there's all those record sales. All that. Where the hell is it? I have no idea.
Watch this space.
Yes.
Richard, thank you so much. Your movie is absolutely spectacular. He would be so proud. I think that knowing that you and everyone that loves him most have done this definitive piece of art, really.
I hope so.
What a gift you've given all of us.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think that he planned it all along, that he sort of, he didn't just get me up to make the first video, Burn For You, that he actually got me up to make the biography of his life in case, I think he hoped that he was going to be alive when that happened, but the biopic of his life, I think there was some plan that, and I felt that I owed him that. I felt that without literally saying it, I felt he'd made content and kept making content, and he was just too shy to say, will you make a film about all this one day?
Thanks for listening to No Filter. Richard's film Mystify, Michael Hutchence, is in all good cinemas from the 4th of July, and I cannot wait to go and see it again. If you want to hear about Michael's life from a very different perspective, you might want to have a listen to the interview I did with his sister-in-law, Mandy Nolan. She was married to Michael's brother, Rhett, and she was married to Rhett at the time that Michael died. I remember Rhett was one of the pallbearers, and I spoke to her about what that whole experience was like. She and Rhett were really poor. They were on Centrelink at the time, and Michael would sort of fly in and out of the country, and they would be whisked off to live this very glamorous life for a short period of time before being deposited back in Byron Bay. And what she had to say was just really interesting. Again, another woman who has a lot of insight into Michael Hutchence. She's also the host of our podcast about separation and divorce called The Split. Just search Mandy Nolan, No Filter, in your podcast app, or follow the link in our show notes. No Filter is produced by Liza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and I'll see you on Mamma Mia.